The paper was delivered on the 1st of November, 1888. It came in the hand of a young man named Finch, a clerk from the Carbon Valley Coal and Coke Company, whose face was still smooth with the conviction that rules were the highest form of reality. He did not remove his hat when Elara Vance opened the door. The air that swept in with him smelled of pine and the coming snow, a clean, sharp scent that was immediately fouled by the legal ink on the document he held. It was an eviction notice. 14 days to vacate Company House number 17. The reason cited was the termination of her husband's employment, an absurdly bureaucratic way of saying that Silas was dead. He had been dead for 6 months, killed in a rock slide up on the North Seam, and the company's initial generosity, allowing her to remain in the house through the summer, had now curdled into a simple matter of accounting. The house was an asset. She was a liability. Finch explained this with a placid sort of patience, as if instructing a child on the mechanics of a clock. The company, he said, was not without sympathy, and had therefore authorized a final settlement of $65 to assist with her transition. He slid the envelope containing the money onto the small table by the door. Elara looked at the paper, then at the envelope, then at the young man's earnest, untroubled face. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. The composure she maintained was a wall, solid and inert, and Mr. Finch seemed to take it as acquiescence. He had likely expected tears, or pleading, or some other feminine display that would have made his task unpleasant. Her quiet stillness was, to him, a form of cooperation. He tipped the brim of his hat, a gesture more of dismissal than respect, and said, "The company wishes you well, Mrs. Vance." Then he was gone, his boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that had already formed on the porch steps. She closed the door and stood for a long moment in the silence of the small two-room house. It was Silas's house. Every floorboard that creaked under her weight, every nail in the walls, every pane of glass that looked out onto the narrow, muddy street of Carbon Creek, Colorado, was his. He had earned it with 10 years of labor in the dark, pulling coal from the earth at 9,500 feet. The notice in her hand stated that his labor, and therefore his life, had purchased his widow exactly 6 months and 14 days of shelter. She walked to the window and watched Mr. Finch move down the street. A thin man in a dark coat, a folio of papers under his arm, dispensing administrative cruelty with the detached efficiency of a postman delivering the mail. The mountains rose up behind the town, jagged granite peaks already white with snow against a steel-gray sky. The wind was picking up, rattling the window frame. It was a north wind, the kind that carried the first true bite of winter. She was 34 years old. She had $65, and she had 14 days until the wilderness, which had already taken her husband, would come to claim his house. She did not move from the window for nearly an hour. She simply watched the sky darken and felt the temperature drop through the single pane of glass. The grief she had held at a careful distance for half a year was a cold, heavy thing inside her. But it was not the thing that commanded her attention now. What she felt instead was a strange and terrible clarity, the kind that comes when every superfluous detail of a life has been stripped away. There was no room for sorrow. Sorrow was a luxury. What was required now was calculation. She turned from the window, leaving the eviction notice and the envelope of money on the sill, and walked to the kitchen table to begin the arithmetic of survival. After Mr. Finch had gone, Elara sat down at the small pine table where she and Silas had taken every meal. She did not light the lamp, preferring the fading gray light of the afternoon. On a blank page in her household ledger, she drew a line down the middle, On one side, she wrote assets. On the other, liabilities. The first list was brutally short. She wrote, cash on hand, $65. Below that, she added her physical possessions: 2 wool blankets, a cast-iron skillet, a Dutch oven, a good knife, her sewing kit, 3 dresses, her winter coat and boots, and Silas's books and tools. That was all. She was 34 years old, in good health. She added that to the list, a grim sort of inventory. Health, sound. She had no family to speak of. Her parents were buried in a churchyard in Ohio, and Silas had been an orphan. There was no one to send a wire to, no one to ask for help. The liabilities column was longer. She wrote, no home after November 15th, no income, winter approaching. The elevation of Carbon Creek was 9,500 feet. Winters here were not a matter of inconvenience. They were a lethal force. Temperatures regularly fell to 30 below zero, and snow could pile 6 feet deep on level ground, deeper in the drifts. To be without shelter here was a death sentence. She methodically listed her options, and then, one by one, she crossed them out. She could take the stagecoach to Denver. The ticket cost $18. She would arrive with $47 to her name. She had read the advertisements in the Denver papers that sometimes found their way up the mountain. Boarding houses seek young women for domestic work. She was no longer a young woman. The 14-hour days of a laundress or a kitchen maid were for girls of 18, not for a widow approaching middle age. The wages were $1 a day, of which 50 cents would go immediately to room and board. She would be destitute within 3 months. She drew a firm line through Denver. She could seek work in Carbon Creek. But what work? The town was a company town. Every job, from the miners to the clerks to the men who swept the saloon floor, was controlled by Carbon Valley Coal and Coke. They had just evicted her. They would not hire her. The only independent businesses were Mr. Abernathy's general store and the saloon, both of which were family operations with no need for outside help. Mrs. Gable, the mine foreman's wife, sometimes paid for mending, but it was pennies, not a living. She crossed out local work. She could appeal to the company's charity, perhaps to the superintendent, Mr. Davies. She could plead her case, emphasize her husband's loyal service, the tragic nature of his death. The thought was like swallowing ash. The company had already made its calculation. They had translated Silas's life and her loss into a check for $65. They had weighed her humanity on a scale and found it wanting. To beg would be to ratify their judgment, to agree that she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. She would not do it. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She crossed out appeal. The list of discarded options left a stark, empty space on the page. The sun had set, and the room was now deep in shadow. The cold from the floorboards seeped into her feet. She was trapped. The logic was as inescapable as the geography of the valley itself, a deep trough between impassable mountains. She had no money, no family, and no options. The system that had sustained her life, the company, the town, the small web of social obligations, had cast her out as neatly as a spent cartridge. The world had a place for a miner's wife. It had no place for a miner's widow. She sat in the dark, the ledger open before her, the final calculation made. There was nothing left. It was in that moment of absolute emptiness, with the wind howling outside, that she remembered Silas's journals. She lit the kerosene lamp, the sudden flare of light chasing the shadows into the corners of the room. Silas's books and papers were in a small wooden chest at the foot of their bed. He had not been a man of many possessions, but his journals he had treasured. They were filled with his observations as a company geologist, but they were more than that. They were filled with his way of seeing the world. He saw the land not as a landscape, but as a machine, a system of forces and materials. He wrote about rock formations, soil composition, and the flow of water with the precision of a watchmaker. Ilara had often found the entries dense and technical, but she had loved the careful, elegant handwriting, the way his mind worked on the page. She lifted the journals out, running her hand over the worn leather bindings. There were 5 of them, covering his decade in these mountains. She started with the most recent, her hands moving through the pages with a desperate, unfocused hope. What she was looking for, she did not know. A forgotten mention of a friend? A note about a distant relative? Some clue she had missed? She found only geological data, sketches of rock strata, and notes on coal seam thickness. She was about to close the last journal when a particular entry, dated October 15th of the previous year, caught her eye. It was not the technical language, but the heading he had written at the top: "The Sunstone Shelf, a perfect winter trap." Her breath caught. The Sunstone Shelf was a local name for a long, south-facing limestone outcrop about 3 miles up the valley, away from the mine. Silas had been fascinated by it. He believed the limestone was of a particularly high quality, though not in a seam thick enough to be commercially viable. He had gone there often on his days off, just to study it. She began to read the entry aloud, her voice a whisper in the quiet room. "The formation is remarkable," Silas had written. "A shallow cavern, more a deep recess than a true cave, approximately 12 feet in depth and 8 feet wide. Ceiling height slopes from 7 feet at the mouth to 5 at the rear. Crucially, the entrance faces due south, maximizing solar exposure during the low winter sun. The overhang protects it completely from the prevailing north and west winds." He had drawn a rough sketch, a cross-section of the hillside showing the cave. An arrow indicated the path of the winter sun. But it was the next part that made her stop. "The most singular feature," the entry continued, "is a natural fissure in the ceiling, a vertical crack no more than 3 inches wide, which extends upwards through at least 20 feet of rock. It functions as a perfect flue. I tested it with a small fire of dry pine needles. The smoke drew up and out with astonishing efficiency. The thermal properties of this particular limestone are also significant. It possesses a high specific heat capacity. It will absorb and retain thermal energy." He had underlined that last sentence twice. Then came the final, prophetic lines. "A man could winter here with a good fire. The rock holds the heat like a brick oven. It is a natural shelter of profound elegance." Ilara stared at the page, at the neat, calm handwriting of her dead husband. It was not a memory. It was not a map to a hidden cache of gold. It was something far more valuable. It was knowledge. It was a set of instructions, delivered from across the silent gulf of death. Silas, in his patient, scientific curiosity, had found a place. He had analyzed it, measured it, and understood its properties. And in doing so, without ever knowing the desperate circumstances his wife would face, he had prepared a refuge for her. He had left her an inheritance not of money, but of geological fact: a south-facing wall, a roof of solid rock, a natural chimney, and the thermal mass of a mountain. She was not alone. He had, in his own way, left her a key. She closed the journal and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, what she had to do next. The next morning, She rose before dawn. The air was thin and sharp, each breath a small shock of cold. She dressed in her sturdiest clothes, packed a small canvas sack with a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and Silas's journal, and set out from Carbon Creek. She told no one where she was going. The town was still asleep, the windows of the company houses dark, smoke curling weakly from a few chimneys. She walked east, following the narrow wagon road that led away from the mine and deeper into the valley. Silas's instructions were clear, his map a simple but precise rendering of the local topography. Follow Carbon Creek upstream for 2 miles until the valley narrows. The shelf is on the north side of the creek, a pale limestone band visible 100 feet up the slope. The walk was arduous. The road quickly devolved into a rough trail, and she had to push her way through fallen timber and dense thickets of scrub oak. The elevation gain was steady, and the air grew thinner still. After an hour, she left the trail and began to climb the slope, using Silas's sketch to guide her. The ground was loose scree and dirt, studded with ponderosa pine and the skeletal white trunks of aspen. She found the limestone band, a stripe of pale gray rock running horizontally across the mountainside. As Silas had noted, it was hidden from below, obscured by a dense growth of mountain laurel. She pushed through the stiff, waxy leaves and suddenly, she was there. The entrance to the shelter was a dark slash in the pale rock, no more than 8 feet across. It was exactly as he had described it. She stepped inside, out of the wind. The silence was immediate and profound. The space was not a deep, claustrophobic cave, but a wide, protected alcove. It was about the size of the kitchen in her company house. The floor was a mix of packed earth and flat, embedded stone, sloping gently downwards from back to front, which meant any moisture would drain out rather than pool inside. The ceiling was a solid, arching vault of limestone, and looking up, she saw it. A dark, narrow crack near the back, the natural flue. She walked to the rear of the shelter and ran her hand over the rock wall. It was cold, but it was a dry, solid cold, the deep, latent chill of the earth itself. It felt ancient and permanent. This was the thermal mass Silas had written about. This was the stone that would hold her fire's heat. She stood in the center of the space and took a slow, deliberate inventory. The southern exposure was perfect. Even now, with the sun low in the autumn sky, a broad patch of pale light fell across the entrance. In the depths of winter, that sunlight, however weak, would strike the back wall for several hours a day, a passive deposit of warmth into her stone battery. The overhang of the shelf above would protect the entrance from all but the most direct, driving snow. The location was remote, hidden from the main trail, unlikely to be discovered by accident. She took out the journal and sat on a flat stone near the entrance, comparing the reality of the place to her husband's careful notes. Every detail was correct. The dimensions, the orientation, the drainage, the ventilation. He had seen it all. He had understood it all. This was not a desperate gamble. It was an engineering problem, and Silas had already provided the blueprint. This place could work. It could actually work. A feeling that was not quite hope, but a grim, clear-eyed resolve settled over her. This stone recess was not a home. It was a tool. And with it, she would survive the winter that the Carbon Valley Coal and Coke Company had intended to be her last. She would not freeze. She would not starve. She would take the $65 they had given her, the price they had put on her life, and she would use it to purchase the means of her own salvation. She walked the 3 miles back to Carbon Creek with a new purpose, her steps quick and sure on the frozen ground. Her destination was Abernathy's General Store, the one place in town not owned outright by the mining company. Mr. Abernathy was a man of 70, with hands gnarled by arthritis and eyes that had seen too many winters in the high country. He had known Silas not as a company asset, but as the quiet man who bought books on geology and always paid his accounts on time. When Ilara entered, the bell above the door jingling, he looked up from his ledger and gave her a slow, sad nod. He had heard the news of her eviction. News, good or bad, traveled fast in a town of 100 souls. Ilara did not waste time with pleasantries or explanations. She walked to the counter with Silas's journal in her hand, open to a blank page where she had made her list. Her budget was $40. $25 had to be held in absolute reserve. Her voice was steady as she began. "Mr. Abernathy, I need a good shovel, and a small pickaxe, the kind for prospecting, and a handsaw with a sharp blade." The absence of an axe on her list was a deliberate, calculated choice. An axe was a tool for felling trees, for claiming fuel from the living forest. It was heavy, and it required a strength and stamina she wasn't sure she could maintain. A handsaw was different. It was a tool for scavenging. It was for processing the deadfall, the standing dead timber, the fallen branches already seasoned by the dry mountain air. It was a tool of efficiency, not brute force, and that was the principle upon which her entire plan was built. Abernathy looked at her list, then at her face. He saw no panic, only a stark, unyielding determination. He hobbled over to the wall where the tools hung. "The shovel is $2.50, he said, his voice raspy. "Pickaxe is $2. A good distant handsaw will cost you $1.75. He laid them on the counter. The total was $6.25. She continued down her list. 50 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of dried pinto beans, 10 pounds of salt, a 5-pound tin of lard. These were the staples of survival, calories in their densest, most stable form. And a block of lye soap, a dozen boxes of safety matches, and 2 extra wicks for my lamp. Abernathy gathered the items, his movements slow and methodical. He weighed the flour and beans himself, his hand steady on the brass scale. He knew what this collection of goods meant. This was not a shopping list for a woman moving to Denver. This was a list for someone preparing to winter in the wild. He did not ask questions. He did not offer pity. He simply filled her order. The provisions came to another $11. Her total was now $17.25. As she counted out the coins from her purse, he turned and took a heavy wool blanket from a high shelf. It was a deep forest green, tightly woven, the kind that cost $4. He folded it and placed it with her other supplies. "And this," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He then added a small sack of coffee beans and a full 1-gallon tin of kerosene. "I can't pay for those, Mr. Abernathy," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. He waved a gnarled hand, dismissing her protest. "Silas kept an account here for 10 years, always settled it square on payday. Consider this the final closing of his books." He looked her directly in the eye. "He was a good man. He would not want to see you go into winter unprepared." It was an act of quiet alliance, a recognition of her struggle and a vote of confidence in her ability to meet it. He saw her not as a victim, but as a combatant. He was offering her not charity, but armament. She nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the gift and the respect it carried. She paid her $17.25, and he helped her load the supplies into a wheelbarrow he insisted she borrow. She had $47.75 left, her tools, and enough food to last months if she was careful. She had what she needed. The construction could begin. The next 10 days were a blur of relentless, punishing labor, the kind that left her muscles screaming and her hands raw. Each day she rose in the dark, cold cabin, ate a piece of dry bread, and pushed the heavy wheelbarrow the 3 miles to the sunstone shelf. The work was governed by a strict and logical sequence. The first priority was the wall. The shelter was protected from the north and west, but the southern opening, while a blessing for light, was a vulnerability to wind and blowing snow. Using the pickaxe, she broke loose hundreds of flat, plate-like pieces of limestone from the scree slope below the cave. The stone was heavy, and her first attempts at carrying it up the slope were clumsy and exhausting. She quickly learned to select only the pieces she could manage, to use her legs and not her back, to rest for 60 seconds after every trip. Slowly, methodically, she began to build. She dry-stacked the stones, fitting them together like pieces of a vast, irregular puzzle. Silas had once explained the principle to her. A good dry-stack wall relies on gravity and friction, with each stone placed to lock the ones around it. She built a low wall, 3 feet high and 2 feet thick, across the eastern half of the entrance. It was a brutal, painstaking process. She worked until her arms trembled with fatigue, until the sun dipped below the western ridge, and then she would walk the 3 miles back to the company house, fall into bed, and sleep the sleep of the utterly spent. After 4 days, the wall was complete. It was not beautiful, but it was solid, a formidable barrier that channeled the wind and would soon anchor the snows that would provide even greater insulation. Her next task was fuel. This was the central challenge, the pivot on which her survival turned. Without an axe, she could not attack the forest. She had to become a scavenger, a gleaner of what the forest had already shed. She spent 3 full days with the handsaw, walking the slopes around her shelter. She looked for standing dead timber, aspen and pine killed by lightning or disease, their wood already seasoned on the stump. She would saw through the base of a small dead tree, no more than 6 inches in diameter, and then limit where it fell, sawing the trunk and branches into uniform 16-inch lengths. It was slow, repetitive work. The rasp of the saw was the only sound besides the wind in the pines. She learned to read the wood, to tell the difference between the light, fast-burning aspen and the dense, resinous pine that would burn hotter and longer. She hauled the wood back to the cave, stacking it with obsessive care. 1 pile for aspen, for quick morning fires to take the chill off. Another for pine, for the steady, enduring heat of the day and night. She organized it by size, from small kindling to the thickest rounds. The growing woodpile inside the cave was a testament to her labor, a physical measure of her security. It was her wealth, more precious than any dollar. By the 10th day, she had a supply she estimated would last a month, and she had identified the locations of enough standing deadwood to last the entire winter. Finally, she addressed the entrance. In the narrow opening left by her stone wall, she needed a door. She used the last of her salvaged materials from town, a large, heavy canvas tarp that had once covered a wagon. She built a simple frame of stout pine branches, lashing them together with twine. She stretched the canvas over the frame and secured it, creating a crude but effective barrier. She hinged it to the rock face with loops of rope, weighting the bottom with a heavy log so the wind could not lift it. On the 14th day, her final day in the company house, she moved her few remaining possessions, her blankets, her cooking pots, Silas's journals, to the cave. She swept the floors of the house one last time, left the key on the kitchen table, and walked away without looking back. That night, for the first time, she slept in her new home. She built a small, precise fire of pine directly beneath the flue, lay down on her blankets, and watched the smoke rise in a perfect, unwavering column into the darkness. The stone walls around her began, imperceptibly at first, to drink in the heat. The first true test came in the last week of November. A storm rolled in from the northwest, a vast, churning mass of gray cloud that swallowed the peaks and descended upon the valley. The temperature, which had hovered just below freezing, plummeted. By the first night of the storm, it was 20 degrees below zero, with a wind that drove the snow horizontally. For 4 days, the blizzard raged. The world outside Alara's shelter was a white chaos, a maelstrom of wind and ice. Inside, there was only stillness and the quiet, steady work of survival. Her days took on a monastic rhythm, dictated by the needs of the fire and the slow passage of time. She would wake in the near darkness, the air in the cave chilled to just above freezing. Her first act was always to tend the fire. She would add small pieces of dry aspen, which caught quickly and burned with a bright, hot flame, raising the temperature of the small space in minutes. Once the initial chill was gone, she would switch to the denser pine, adding exactly 4 16-inch pieces per hour. This was the rhythm she had discovered through trial and error. A small, hot fire, constantly fed, was far more efficient than a large, roaring blaze. It consumed less wood and produced almost no smoke, only a shimmering column of heat that rose directly into the flue. The limestone walls, after days of continuous gentle heating, had achieved thermal equilibrium. They were no longer cold to the touch. They radiated a steady, low-level warmth back into the shelter, a gentle and persistent heat that felt like a living presence. She kept a small tin thermometer Silas had used for his geological work. While the storm howled outside at 20, and then 30, below zero, the temperature inside her stone refuge never dropped below 45 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a differential of 75 degrees, an astonishing feat of engineering accomplished with scavenged wood and a deep understanding of thermodynamics. In the margins of Silas's last journal, she kept her own meticulous records. November 28th. Temperature outside, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperature inside, 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Wood consumed, 88 pieces pine, 12 pieces aspen. Food, 1 cup beans, 1/4 pound flour for flatbread. Kerosene lamp burned for 3 hours. The act of recording was a discipline, a way of asserting order against the chaos outside. It was a conversation with her husband, a continuation of his own scientific work. She was no longer just a subject in his journal. She was a collaborator. The snow piled up. It buried her canvas door, then climbed the stone wall she had built. By the 3rd day, the entire entrance to the shelter was sealed behind a drift that was 6 feet deep. She was entombed, but the snow was not a threat. It was a blessing. It was the final layer of insulation, a thick, downy blanket that sealed every crack and held the precious warmth inside. A small amount of air still circulated through the snow and down her flue, enough to feed the fire and keep the air fresh, but the howling wind was silenced. The world went quiet. She was safe, warm, and utterly alone, living on stored food and stored heat. A single point of life in a frozen, indifferent wilderness. On the 4th day, the storm broke. The sun came out, brilliant and blinding on the new snow. She used her shovel to dig a narrow tunnel out from her door. When she emerged, blinking, into the clean, cold air. She saw a world transformed, buried under a sea of white. She had been tested. The shelter had held. Her calculations had been correct. By mid-January, the deep cold had settled into the valley like a permanent condition. The residents of Carbon Creek were struggling. The company's coal allotments were insufficient, and the wood many had stockpiled was green or frozen, burning with a smoky, unsatisfying heat that did little to warm the drafty company houses. Sickness, a constant companion of winter at high altitude, began to spread. It was during a rare mid-month thaw, when the temperature climbed to a balmy 10 degrees, that a man named Jedediah found her. He was an old trapper, one of the few men in the valley who did not work for the mine. He was checking his marten lines along the upper creek when he saw the thin, almost invisible plume of heat rising from the snow-covered slope. Curiosity got the better of him. He approached cautiously, his snowshoes making soft, crunching sounds. He saw the narrow opening of the tunnel and the dark shape of the canvas door within. He called out, his voice gruff. "Hello, the shelter." Ilara, startled, grabbed the small pickaxe and stood just inside the door. When he identified himself, she recognized the name. Jedediah was a fixture in town, a man who kept to himself but was known to be honest. She opened the door. The trapper stared, his weathered face a mask of disbelief. He had heard the rumors that the widow Vance had simply vanished, most likely taking the stage to Denver. To find her here, alive and apparently well, in a hole in the rock, was a shock. But what truly astonished him was the wave of warmth that washed over him from the shelter's entrance. It was a deep, radiant heat, not the scorching blast of a big fire. He peered inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He saw the neat stacks of wood, the small, glowing fire pit, the relative comfort of the space. "By God, woman," he breathed, his voice filled with a grudging respect. "You've made yourself a proper den." He understood immediately what she had done. He had spent 50 winters in these mountains and knew the lethal power of the cold. He also knew genius when he saw it. He did not stay long, but he left her with a gift of 3 rabbits from his traps and a promise to keep her location to himself. But secrets were a luxury in a small, isolated community. Word spread, carried not by the trapper, but by the simple, unavoidable fact of her survival. People began to talk. The woman who had been evicted, left for dead, was alive. And she was warm. A week later, a knock came at her canvas door. It was Sarah Gable, the mine foreman's wife. Her face was pale and drawn, her eyes shadowed with worry. Her youngest son, she explained, was sick with a lung fever, and the cold in their house was relentless. They burned through their coal ration in 2 weeks, and the wood they had was barely enough to keep a fire smoldering. She had heard the stories. She didn't know if they were true, but she was desperate. "They say you know something about staying warm," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Ilara looked at the exhausted woman and felt not pity, but a sense of shared struggle. She invited her in. Mrs. Gable gasped as the warmth enveloped her. Ilara did not offer her a handout of wood. To do so would only solve the problem for a day and would deplete her own carefully husbanded supply. Instead, she offered knowledge, the only thing she possessed in abundance. She explained the principle of the small, hot fire. She took out Silas's journal and showed the woman his sketches of the flue, explaining how proper ventilation was key. She described how to find standing deadwood, how to distinguish it from green wood, how to stack it so the air could dry it. She taught her about insulation, about stuffing rags into the cracks in the walls of her company house, about hanging blankets over the windows. She was giving away the secrets of her own survival. Mrs. Gable listened, her expression shifting from desperation to focused attention. She was a practical woman, and she understood the practical wisdom Ilara was sharing. She left an hour later, her face set with a new determination. The next day, 2 more families came, then another. Ilara became an unlikely oracle. They came to her shelter not to beg for fuel, but to learn how to use what little they had. She would draw diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick, explaining the physics of heat and convection in the simplest terms. She became, without ever choosing it, the quiet, beating heart of the community's resilience, a source of practical knowledge for the very people who had watched in silence as she was cast out. The stories of the widow in the cave eventually reached the ears of the mine superintendent, a man named Davies, who managed the Carbon Valley operation from a warm office in Denver. His initial reaction was one of annoyance and concern over liability. A squatter on company land was a legal problem. If she froze to death, it would be a moral and public relations problem. He dispatched one of his junior engineers, Arthur Madsen, with instructions to assess the situation and, if necessary, remove Mrs. Vance by force if required. Madsen was a young man, educated at the Colorado School of Mines, with a mind accustomed to blueprints, stress calculations, and formal engineering principles. He arrived in Carbon Creek in early February, riding in on a company sleigh, and made the trek up to the Sunstone Shelf with 2 miners as guides. He expected to find a pathetic, smoke-filled hovel, a scene of desperate poverty. He was prepared to be firm, to deliver the company's orders with detached authority. When he ducked through the snow tunnel and entered Ilara's shelter, he stopped dead. The air was warm, dry, and clean. There was no smoke. A small, almost silent fire burned brightly under the flue. The space was orderly, the wood piles arranged with geometric precision. Ilara met his gaze with a calm, unreadable expression. She was not intimidated. Madsen, the engineer, took over. He pulled a thermometer from his coat. The temperature outside was 5 degrees below zero. Inside, his thermometer registered 52 degrees, a 57-degree differential. He stared at the number in disbelief. He walked to the back wall and laid his palm against the limestone. It was warm to the touch. He looked up at the flue, studying the steady laminar flow of the rising heat. He understood instantly. "My God," he said, speaking more to himself than to her. "It's a thermal flywheel." He began to walk the space, his professional curiosity overriding his official mission. He examined her dry stack wall, noting the interlocking construction. He inspected her wood piles, recognizing the different burn properties of the aspen and pine. He was not seeing a squatter's den. He was seeing a brilliant, intuitive application of thermodynamic principles. "You've maximized the thermal inertia of the limestone mass," he said, the technical jargon spilling out. "The southern exposure provides passive solar gain, and the flue creates a constant convective loop. This is a radiant heating system of remarkable efficiency." He looked at Ilara, his initial arrogance replaced by a profound and genuine respect. "Mrs. Vance, where did you learn to do this?" "My husband studied this place," she said simply, gesturing to Silas's journal, which lay open on a small stone shelf. "He understood the rock. I just built the fire." Madsen picked up the journal and looked at the sketches, the temperature notes, the careful calculations. He saw Silas's work, and then he looked at the neat columns of Ilara's own data in the margins, her fuel consumption rates, her temperature logs. He realized he was not looking at a single act of desperation, but a sustained scientific experiment. What she had built was more than a shelter. It was a prototype. It was a solution to the very problem the Carbon Valley Coal and Coke Company faced every winter: how to keep its men alive and working in remote, high-altitude camps with minimal fuel. The company spent thousands of dollars on coal and wood, much of which was wasted in inefficient, drafty bunkhouses. What this woman had done, with a handsaw and $65, was more effective than anything the company's own engineers had devised. His purpose shifted entirely. He was no longer there to evict her. He was there to learn from her. His report to Mr. Davies would not be a recommendation for removal. It would be a proposal for employment. The expert's recognition was not what gave her work value. The warmth of her cave and the survival of her neighbors had already done that. But it was the key that would unlock the door to her vindication. Arthur Madson's report landed on Superintendent Davies's desk like a lit stick of dynamite. It did not describe a vagrant, but an innovator. It did not speak of liability, but of opportunity. Madsen used the language of efficiency and cost savings, the only language men like Davies truly understood. He detailed the Vance Radiant Heating System, as he termed it, calculating the potential reduction in fuel expenditure for the company's remote survey camps to be upwards of 70%. He described a system that was not only efficient, but replicable, built from local materials by unskilled labor, provided they had the proper instruction. The source of that instruction, he concluded, was currently living in a cave on company land. Davies was a pragmatist. He was facing a winter of low productivity, grumbling miners, and rising fuel costs. Madsen's report offered him an elegant solution, but it came with a significant complication. The solution was embodied by the woman his company had treated with cold, bureaucratic disdain. To hire her would be to admit the company's error, a bitter pill for a man like Davies to swallow, but the numbers Madsen presented were undeniable. Pride was a luxury. Profit was a necessity. He authorized Madsen to make an offer. A week later, the young engineer once again made the trek to the Sunstone Shelf. He did not come with eviction orders, but with a contract. He sat with Alara by her small, steady fire and laid out the terms. The Carbon Valley Coal and Coke Company offered her a position as a consultant at a salary of $50 per month through the winter. Her duties would be to design and oversee the construction of similar thermal shelters at 3 of the company's most remote outposts. Alara listened without expression. She let the silence stretch after he finished, feeling the solid warmth of the limestone at her back. They had cast her out, expecting her to freeze or flee. Now they needed the knowledge she had forged in that very crucible. They were not offering charity. They were trying to buy her mind. She would sell it to them, but at her own price. "The salary is acceptable," she said, her voice even. "But I have 2 conditions. First, the deed to Company House number 17 is to be signed over to me, free and clear. It is my home, paid for by my husband's labor." Madsen nodded. "Mr. Davies anticipated that. He has agreed." "My second condition," she continued, her gaze unwavering, "is a formal written apology from the company, signed by Mr. Davies himself, for the manner of my eviction. And the clerk, Mr. Finch, is to be the one who delivers it to me." This gave Madsen pause. It was one thing to reverse a business decision. It was another to demand an admission of moral failure. But he saw the look in her eyes and knew this point was not negotiable. It was not about vengeance. It was about justice. It was about restoring a balance that had been violated. He promised to convey her terms. 2 days later, a visibly uncomfortable Mr. Finch appeared at the entrance to her snow tunnel, a legal deed in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. He would not meet her eye. He mumbled the required words, handed her the documents, and fled back down the mountain. The reckoning was quiet, administrative, delivered on paper just as the initial cruelty had been. There was no triumphalism in her victory. The cost had been too high. Silas was still gone. The months of fear and brutal labor could not be erased. But the injustice had been named, and it had been answered. Ilara fulfilled her contract with the same methodical diligence she had applied to her own survival. She traveled with Madsen to the remote camps, teaching the miners how to read the land, how to build with stone, how to manage a fire. She was patient and clear, her authority rooted not in a title, but in undeniable competence. The men, initially skeptical, came to respect her deeply. She was not a boss. She was a teacher who had earned her knowledge the hard way. When the spring thaw finally came, melting the deep snows and bringing the first hints of green to the aspen, she collected her final payment and moved back into her house in Carbon Creek. The house was hers now, the deed recorded in the county seat. But she did not abandon the Sunstone Shelf. Twice a week, she made the walk up the valley, clearing the trail, checking the stone wall, and ensuring the shelter remained dry and ready. She restocked the woodpiles, not with the desperate fervor of the previous fall, but with the calm certainty of a woman who understood the value of a refuge. She would never again be solely dependent on a company's payroll or a community's goodwill. She had learned that true security was not something that could be given or taken away by a man with a piece of paper. It was something you built yourself, out of stone and knowledge and the will to endure. She had not been rescued. She had rescued herself. The shelter remained, a silent testament to the woman the world had tried to discard and the engineer she had become.